The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a question anybody in the panel that has an answer. In 2016, I understand there were reports that I think were sound that Russia tried to interfere with a lot of state election rolls, maybe all of them. Anybody here aware of those reports? Mr. Masterson, you seem to be first to go to the buzzer.
Probably foolishly, sir. Thank you. Yeah, the DHS, in coordination with the FBI, released a information product out to state and local election officials that stated that based on the information we have, as far as the activity in 2016, that the pattern of behavior, it is likely that the Russian government or the Russian actors conducted at least research on election entities across all 50 states. That doesn't necessarily mean that they attempted to access the systems. It could be as simple as a Google search to understand who runs elections in that state, but based on the information that we and the intelligence community have, that it is assumed that they were at least researching all 50 states' election system.
And why would they have done that?
Presumably, I don't want to speculate, but presumably just to understand how elections are run across the United States and gather information.
Kind of spring training?
Don't know.
Yeah, something like that. Anybody else have knowledge of that? Have any other thoughts about it? No. How about Florida? Was there not reports that 2 different jurisdictions' voting systems were contacted by the Russians? Mr. Hickey?
So I think we have briefed Florida officials on activity targeting systems and leading to successful intrusions in 2 counties. But I think it's important to be clear, we've also reached the conclusion that there was no material impact on registration or vote counting based on the evidence that we've seen. So I think it is important to be clear about that.
Based on what happened in 2016 and based on what Mr. Mueller told us that the Russians at the time he testified were looking into being involved in our 2020 elections, are you confident that we have given our funds directly to the states, that they will use them to work against Russian and cyber interference and protect those state systems?
I'm happy to talk about that. So at the EAC, we distributed the $380 million from FY18. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, it appears that the vast majority of that will be spent. We're seeing over 90% of that going toward improving security. Again, whether that's replacing outdated equipment, hardening systems, implementing audits. The states have done a number of things, but because of the variations in how elections are administered state to state, there have been different priorities.
Mr. Masterson?
Sir, just briefly on that, we worked with our Government Coordinating Council, which has 24 state and local election officials as a member, to identify priorities for that funding. What we've seen is states have taken that information, which is data-based on our work with the states on where risks lie, and used it to apply. And I'll give you a very specific example. Prior to the 2018 election, the state of Wisconsin deployed 2-factor authentication out to all of its local election officials for the statewide voter registration database, which may seem unremarkable until you realize they have 1,800 local election jurisdictions in the state of Wisconsin and almost 3,200 users of the statewide voter registration database. And so that's a very focused, targeted step, base level that they've taken and used the money.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Masterson. Director Krebs has emphasized the importance of protecting the campaigns based on what happened in 2016 with interference with the DNC, the Clinton campaign, stolen emails, et cetera. He said, shame on us if we're not ready this time around. Have you consulted with the president or anyone involved in his re-election campaign?
Sir, we have made contact with not just the Trump campaign, but campaigns across the presidential election, presidential campaigns, to make sure that they are aware of our services and information sharing responsibility.
So Mr. Mulvaney did not contact you as he did your superior and say, this is a very sensitive subject for the president, don't mention it or dance around it or whatever?
No, sir.
Okay, Ali and free, that's great. I want to thank the FBI, the Justice Department as well. Y'all are stalwarts in the American system of government and the rule of law. And I would have to disagree with some previous statements made that some individuals within your organizations were responsible for hurting your organizations. I think that an individual who's the President of the United States was the one that caused it by questioning those people's actions and down to making statements that were adverse to both the FBI and the Justice Department, which we should uphold. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish this truly were a sincere hearing on election security. If it were, we might be marking up some of the bipartisan legislation that members of the committee have worked on, including House Resolution 3529 by Congresswoman Murphy, Mr. Deutsch, Ms. McChrystal-Powell, myself, to have greater connectivity prior to any intrusion. Or we might be marking up the legislation by Mr. Ratcliffe, Mr. Himes, joined by Mr. Collins and Mr. Khanna, 3238, that would create greater consequence for those who engage in election interference. But that's not what this is about. This is about smearing the President of the United States and validating the corrupt people who have been involved in delegitimizing his historic election. And we know that because just moments ago, the chairman said that Peter Strzok was acting in the highest traditions of government service. Now, Ms. Flores, I believe you currently hold a job that Mr. Strzok once held. Is engaging in an extramarital affair in the FBI with a co-worker acting in the highest traditions of government service?
I'm not going to comment on that, sir.
Well, are there any regulations of the FBI against it that you're aware of?
I'm not going to comment on that, sir.
Well, you hold Mr. Strzok's job. Are you saying that you don't know whether or not it's against FBI policy to have an extramarital affair with a co-worker?
Sir, I hold a slightly different job than Mr. Strzok held. I'm the DAD over the intelligence branch. He was over our operational branch. Not that we are held to a different standard. I'm just not going to comment on whether or not Peter Strzok's behavior was out of context.
Is it in the highest traditions of government service at the FBI to engage in affairs with coworkers? You should know that if you work there.
Sir, I'm not going to comment on that.
Wow. Well, maybe I'll ask you another one. The Inspector General said in his report, we did not have confidence that Strzok's decision to prioritize the Russia investigation over following up on the mid-year related investigation. So if the Inspector General didn't have confidence in the way that someone prioritized something, would that be acting in the highest traditions of government service?
Sir, I'm not going to comment on that.
The Inspector General further said the OIG found it's not only indicative of a biased state of mind, but even more suspiciously implies a willingness to take action to impact the presidential candidate's electoral process. This is antithetical to the core values of the FBI and the Department of Justice. If anyone is engaging in behavior that is antithetical to the core values of the FBI and Department of Justice, is that person acting in the highest traditions of government service?
Sir, we have an entire inspection division. We have the OIG. There are several measures in place that take into account those questions. I'm not going to answer those questions from the position I am in.
It's just really striking that someone in the senior leadership at the FBI, like an unwillingness to be critical of conduct that was so detrimental to our country. And as people all over America are looking at the corruption that negatively impacted our president and the institution of the presidency, it doesn't really inspire confidence that current officials from the FBI say, hey, you know what? It's a bad idea to be having affairs with your colleagues and to be undermining the trust that people have and to be prioritizing investigations over politics. But nonetheless, here we sit. And in fact, here we do sit. You know, it was more than a month ago, Mr. Chairman, that you announced an impeachment inquiry in this committee. And I believed you that our committee would be engaged in that process. But as we sit here today, 3 other committees are in the basement of the Capitol, conducting secret interviews, engaging in selective leaks. You got Chairman Schiff then coming out and having his theatrical re-performances of transcripts that didn't really occur. And you've got lies about contacts with whistleblowers. Now, regardless of how people feel about the president or this impeachment, one would at least think that if the chairman of the Judiciary Committee announces the launch of an impeachment investigation, that members of the Judiciary Committee might be willing to or able to participate in that investigation. But when I've gone to participate, when Mr. Biggs has gone to participate, when others have gone, we've been locked out. So it is my sincere hope, and I asked this the last time we gathered, that you would take up the cause not just of someone's partisan ambition to impeach the president, but that you would take up the cause of our committee and advocate for our ability to participate, because one can only suspect that the reason that the House Judiciary Committee has been dealt out of the hand on impeachment is because Speaker Pelosi didn't like the outcomes that were going on in this committee when the current chairman was running it. I mean, it wasn't a surprise to the country when you brought in Mr. Lewandowski. House Democrats looked like a dog that caught a car and didn't know what to do with it. When House Democrats brought in Robert Mueller, there were promises that this was going to sway the public. This was going to create a flood of support for impeachment. And that was obviously something that didn't hold to bear. And so please stand up for our committee and let's stop with this busy work. If we want to mark up bills, let's mark up real bills. I yield back.